There's a psychological syndrome called the Napoleon complex. The complex states that shorter men show more aggressive behavior because they have to compensate for their height. The complex is based on the famously short French emperor that took over Europe. His inferiority complex must have made him do it. But what if he wasn't short at all? 200 years after his death, people are still obsessed with Napoleon. He's used to sell liquor, sweets, vegetables, and he inspires dance crazes. Still, he wasn't short at all. That's a total myth. You can see the myth at the end of this Vox video about his missing hand.
It's probably pretty telling that almost everyone I asked to do an impression of Napoleon adopted poses based around Napoleon's supposedly short stature and his vanity.
This is my pose.
Okay.
Napoleon. Tiny man, proud chest.
And I think it's actually a general thing what people think about when they think about Napoleon. So I'm in the city of Gdansk, where I just recently moved, and I want to know what the people in the city think about this.
Apparently he made himself tall in pictures.
I think he's about my height, 5'2". I think he was short. Short.
Rather short.
Pretty short, I think.
Short, very short.
Very short.
Yes.
It's like the whole world knows he's short.
Small dick energy.
In this video I'm going to show you how this myth was born and why it still lives on in our day and age. But first, to better understand Napoleon's appeal, I talked to an expert.
Now I'm a professor of history at Princeton University.
In our day and age there's still an obsession with Napoleon. Where does it come from?
I think all the mythologies is that they do emphasize just what an absolutely extraordinary life he had, this extraordinary, almost superhuman career, and the fact that the person himself is relatively relatable.
Napoleon is easily one of the most famous figures in history. Why? Well, he conquered half of Europe, he crowned himself emperor, and he introduced a legal code that is still the standard in many parts of the world. He's both seen as a genius tactician and a dictator that dominated Europe. But I studied history to tell you about his looks. So let's talk about his appearance for a moment.
Before he came to power, he was seen as not being a particularly attractive person. He was very thin, he had sort of unkempt hair, his skin was described as being sallow.
And next to all that, in his later years he got very, very fat. Why do we know that? Well, people have researched it. This is an actual paper talking about his waistline, and they have statistics. Alessandro, how should we use our research skill today? What about statistically fat-shaming Napoleon? Ooh, love that. I know you know these paintings of him, but in reality, he probably wasn't the best-looking fellow. But talking about his height, what historical evidence is there? Well, Napoleon was called Petit Corporal by his men, which translates to something like small corporal. He was also smaller than the men in his bodyguard. And then we know that he was 5'2". I don't know about you, but I only know metric, so this doesn't tell me everything. 5 foot. Okay, yeah, that is really short. So in metric, that is 157. Still, if we look at this evidence, some things start to emerge. First, some historians say that he was measured in French feet at 5'2". But if you compare that to British feet of the time, it would mean he was 5'6", which brings it to 167. I guess another reason to just use metric? It's not really tall for our age, but if you look at his time, in the 1700s, people were just shorter. So either of these two would mean he's either just average or just below average, not super short. What about the other evidence we have? Well, that Petit Corporal was more of a nickname. It didn't have that much to do with his height. And the bodyguard, well, they were chosen to be tall, so no wonder he looked short next to them. Regardless, it's not these things that made Napoleon being short have this lasting image, because that has to do with good old propaganda. Now, Napoleon was no stranger to propaganda himself.
He was just as good at publicizing his victories as he was at winning them. He creates newspapers designed to sort of take the news of his victories back to France. He's commissioning artworks displaying him in various heroic poses.
It's the reason he is remembered as this great statesman. But his enemies would make fun of him in cartoons. Like here he is portrayed as the son of the devil. And here he is a man that has a hook nose and is losing his temper. But then everything changes in 1803, because there's one cartoonist called James Gilray that shows Napoleon Bonaparte like this. Lil Boney. And Lil Boney loses his temper. Lil Boney is stomping around, throwing a table on the floor, toppling a globe. Lil Boney could actually be a great rap name. Still, this cartoon has a big impact. We see this character of Lil Boney in a ton of other cartoons by James Gilray. with a large hat, big boots, and oversized swords. Remember, this is a man that is crushing army after army in Europe. So you can imagine they just want to bring him down a notch. These pictures are just everywhere. Other cartoonists also take it over. And it completely changes how we see Napoleon. Apparently Napoleon himself sent angry letters to the British governments to tell them to make it stop. It's this one image that completely changed the ideas about Napoleon. Here you see a cartoon by a different artist from 1811. Napoleon's empire is already crumbling, and he has nightmares thinking about it. He is haunted by his past. There are soldiers he left behind in the campaign in Egypt. Here you have Toussaint, the leader of the slave rebellion in Haiti. And you have a devil that holds a list of things that plague Napoleon at night. On it, the cartoons by James Gilray. Gilray has such an influence that when Napoleon dies, he supposedly said the following of the cartoons: "They did more than all the armies of Europe to bring me down." But that quote just seems too good to be true. Still, this is what gives us the legend of how tall Napoleon is. Consider the myth busted.
And some people have heard this story.
People think he was small.
Because of the British propaganda.
Still, why is the myth part of our time? Well, David has an answer for that.
One basic reason is that, as the saying goes, victors write the history, and Napoleon lost. So the most influential histories written of him were written in many ways by his enemies, not just in Britain and in Germany and Russia, but also in France itself. So there were plenty of people in France too who wanted to continue to employ this image of this, this small man with the Napoleon complex, and it continued throughout, I think in France throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and of course it continued massively outside of France. So I think the tendency has been for Napoleon to have been written about mostly by people who disapprove of him.
So I guess the moral of the story is, if you are planning to be a world leader, make sure your propaganda is in order. Decide who gets to write histories about you. And calling your enemies names can be very, very effective. That people think Napoleon is short maybe is not the biggest problem. But having your maths off can have real-world consequences. Like the time NASA lost a $125 million spacecraft because some scientists worked in metric and others in imperial. So if you don't want that to happen, you better brush up on your math. That's exactly what I've been doing, with the help of today's sponsor, Brilliant. As a teenager, I was really scared of math. But Brilliant.org takes that fear away and actually makes learning fun. Their approach is really interactive, and that's what makes it so easy to learn about math and computer science. And because they have a mobile app, you can learn wherever, whenever. Like on your daily commute to school or work. It doesn't matter if you want to address childhood trauma, sharpen your mind, or build skills to help your career. It's suited for everyone. And you won't get bored. Brilliant has thousands of lessons. They have lessons in basic math, which is helpful for people like me, but also advanced math, AI, data science, neural networks, and more. And each month they add lessons. So if you're interested and want to check that out, you can try everything Brilliant has to offer for a total of 30 days, free of charge. If you go to my link, brilliant.org/thepresentpast. And the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. And I'll see you in the next one.